Okay, let's get started. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. Welcome to CM2 guest lecture series. CM2 stands for Cooperative Mobility for Competitive Megaregions. It's a US DOT supported center. Today, we have a very distinguished speaker, Professor Jonathan Barnett from University of Pennsylvania, to give a guest lecture. Allow me to introduce you, Professor Barnett. Professor Barnett is one of the pioneers of the modern practice of city design. Discipline firmly grounded in current political, social, and economic realities. He is a fellow of the Penn Institute of Urban Research, and he is a professor emeritus of practice in city and regional planning at the University of Pennsylvania. As a visiting professor, critic, or lecturer at many other universities, including Southeast University in Nanjing of China, Jonathan has helped educate more than a generation of city designers. He was the director of urban design for the New York City Planning Department in the administration of Mayor John Lindsay. His book about innovations created in New York, titled Urban Design as Public Policy, was a strong influence in establishing urban design as a necessary element of local government and in making urban design a well-recognized profession. He has written many other books, book chapters, and articles about urban design. His recent book, written with real estate lawyer Brian W. Blazer, is Reinventing Development Regulations, which shows how to use government controls to implement urban design and sustainability concepts. His even more recent book, last year, 2020, Designing the Megaregion, Meeting Urban Challenges at a New Scale. Professor Barnett is a magna cum laude, distinctive graduate of Yale University, where he was a scholar of the house in architecture and has a master's degree in architecture from the University of Cambridge and a master of architecture from the Yale School of Architecture. He's a fellow of both the American Institute of Architects and the American Institute of Certified Planners. So welcome, Professor Barnett.
Good afternoon. Thank you. I'm delighted to be able to join you from Center City, Philadelphia. I've tried to make what I present to you today as much about Austin as its place in the Texas megaregion as possible. See if I can relate it to experience of some of the people here. And I'm hoping that we can have a discussion about some of the points I'm going to make. So perhaps we should start off by my sharing the screen. Let's see if it's, and then let's, okay. You've seen this picture, I think, a number of times. It's, of course, not an easy picture to take. It was actually a composite of many different views that NASA put together. But it's about the best way of proving that megaregions really exist, is to show them at night. And of course, like the constellations in the sky, what these clusters of lights actually tell you is subject to a lot of interpretation. This is from the Federal Highway Administration, and they are actually, I think, following terminology from the Georgia Institute of Technology. And they divide the country up so that your megaregion is down here. It's called the Texas Triangle, which we'll see doesn't really quite well describe it. Florida is a megaregion. I would advise you, if you can, to get the view of people away so you can see the whole of the slides. Because unfortunately, it depends where you put the gallery of people, but there's bits of the slides underwear just about everywhere you will put it. This is, I think, a very interesting study, which was done by Garrett Nelson at Dartmouth and Alistair Ray at the University of Sheffield. They had more than 4 million trips that they analyzed. And what they're trying to do is show the commuting patterns across the United States. And the assumption is that if you are commuting, you have an economic reason for doing this. So if we look more closely at San Antonio and Austin, we can see that there are some pretty close commuter ties between these two cities, and that there is a connection going up to Dallas. It's more of a question whether Houston, which is supposed to form the third pivot point of the Texas Triangle, is really so much a part of the Texas Triangle as it is part of a coastal megaregion that goes over to New Orleans. But as I say, this is a matter of interpretation. It's how you look at these stars and what you decide you've learned from them. But there are clearly economic ties among these cities, and that's another proof that megaregions actually exist. One of the points that I keep making is that the interstate highway system, the transportation links, are what are creating the dispersal patterns from cities, which are forming these megaregions. So if you look in Google with San Antonio down the lower left going up to Austin, you can see that this really is a continuous megaregion. It's this city all the way, but it's all along I-35. It's not everywhere. So these megaregions, when people talk about urban sprawl, they often say that it's formless, but that's not actually correct. That is, urban sprawl has a very clear structure, which is that it's following access. And as most of the access around the country is highways, most of the structure of the megaregions is along highway corridors. So when you look at megaregions, they definitely have a land use and transportation structure behind them. It's not just growth in a formless, shapeless pattern at all. Again, this shows up very well from the air. Here's San Antonio, here's Austin. Here are communities between Austin and Dallas-Fort Worth, or I should say Dallas-Fort Worth. And over here on the right is Houston. And as you can see, it's not so connected, either from a commuting point of view or from a physical and geographic point of view. However, there's no question that these megaregions are growing. And the projections, as I'm sure all of you have heard, up to the middle of the century, is that something like 80% of the growth that's going to take place in the United States is going to take place within these megaregions. And a very high proportion of the economic activity, which is going on in the United States, is also going to take place in these megaregions. So what I am saying is that there's plenty of time between now and 2050 to design how these megaregions grow. But a lot of people, when you hear the word design, you say, oh, well, that means you're making it pretty, or it's pattern making, or it's aesthetics. And I like this, Herbert Simon, who was an economist and political scientist, said to design is to devise courses of action aimed at changing existing conditions into preferred ones. And it's this ability that designers have of looking at alternative possible futures and evaluating them and choosing them is what I mean by design. So today I thought I would concentrate on just one aspect of megaregions, which is inequality. And the inequality is built into the megaregions. And it was always there, but it was accentuated in the 1930s during the Depression, when there was a federal government agency which for the first time was backing up mortgage loans. And the people making these loans were bureaucrats, and they didn't wish to be stigmatized by failure. So they said to themselves, how do we make sure that we give out loans which are going to get paid back? So they decided to make a hierarchy of places, which was sort of like traffic lights. Green meant go. Blue, which is not a traffic light, is still desirable. Yellow means go slow, and red means stop. And so this is where the concept of redlining comes from. And when you look at the way that they did the housing categories in each city, you can look at Austin and the proportion of red in Austin is actually pretty small. If you look north up to Fort Worth, you can see that the bureaucrats mapped a very large piece of Fort Worth as a place you shouldn't lend money. So there's definitely a discrimination between Fort Worth and Dallas in this government agency. If you look at the actual maps that they used, here's Atlanta. Only the green and the blue areas were where they would make loans. So you see they wrote off a big chunk of the city. Similarly, so the pattern is everywhere the same. It's as true in Detroit. I show Philadelphia. The northern part of the city is considered okay to make loans, and a little slice of the western part of the city. Everything else is off limits. So you can see these patterns now in Google when you look from space, that on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see West Philadelphia. And many parts of West Philadelphia are pretty severely depressed areas. And then you can go out to the mainline suburbs west of the city, and you can see larger lots and green areas. And these are the places where the federal agencies, right up until 1968 and into the 70s, were prepared to make loans, whereas nobody could get a housing loan in this part of the map. So the government is clearly responsible. It reinforced inequality, and it made it more permanent. The other thing that we need to understand about megaregions is that giving people a choice between areas which bankers consider desirable and places that bankers don't consider desirable, people who have a choice are likely to go to the desirable places. So a big piece of the growth of the megaregion, which many people refer to as urban sprawl, has been coming from people getting away from problem areas in cities out to places where they don't perceive there would be any problem. And what I say very strongly is that governments have an obligation to repair these problems. But when I talk to you about them today, I'm going to say that the politics of this are going to be very difficult. It's easy enough to write an op-ed or a position paper in which you say this is wrong and it has to stop. But if you're looking at how to actually make it stop, you have to find some points of leverage where you can decide where you might be able to get something to actually happen. So here's Austin. I don't know if you can see the cursor from, I'm hoping you can. These bright lights are commercial strips running through the city. You're all familiar with these commercial corridors, which have been zoned for commercial development. And most of the time, they don't even permit housing. And usually the real estate value has gone to the point where you can't afford to build housing there anyhow. But that is changing because there's a retail revolution going on. All this e-commerce that is taking place is changing people's habits. And the pandemic, which is going on right now, has caused these habits of shopping to change very completely. So most people are now getting something delivered practically every day. And the bricks and mortar stores, if you look at the, in these strip shopping centers, and you look at the vacancies in these strip shopping centers, there are more and more stores that are not rented. Now, there's certain places, a nail parlor or a barbershop or possibly a restaurant where they need physical people to move into it, and they need to be able to park and so forth. But the percentage of these shopping centers which are like a UPS drop-off or something like that, where you actually need a physical place, are getting much smaller. And so what you're looking at from the air now is a land bank where housing could develop. Here's another example from Dallas, and I spotted this building in the middle of the picture. And I said, what in the world is that? That looks like a prison. You know, it's very dense. So I looked it up. It's called Bluebonnet Studios. And it turns out that Bluebonnet Studios is a new housing development where you get a very minimal apartment, like less than 400 square feet, in which you have your bed and your desk and a couch and your television. And then there's a kitchen and your front door, and they don't even pay for a closet door for your entrance. And hundreds of people are living in this building. So yes, this is residential building, and it's to some extent affordable. Not sure that this is the pattern that you really want to see happening in all of the suburban shopping strips. This is a more general presentation. This is the way most shopping strips are zoned. So they're zoned commercial in this narrow strip along the highway. And then right behind it are residential neighborhoods backing right up on it. And if you look more closely, and this diagram was made several years ago and it was already a problem renting these places, you can see what they call potential opportunities, which is another polite way of saying vacant. And then there are opportunity sites, which are places which are looking like they will be vacant pretty soon. And then, so what the urban designers making this study proposed is that right along the highway, you should have apartments, which would have parking underneath and interior courtyards. And then between this housing and the residential neighborhood, you could have row houses, which are higher density than the neighborhood, but lower density than the apartments, and where you actually own an individual property. And the thinking behind this is that many of the people who live in these suburban communities would like an opportunity to live somewhere else. They're getting old, they're tired of taking care of the yard. Their children have grown up and they'd like to stay in the same neighborhood. So there are political reasons why people like this, people in these neighborhoods might like this change. So what about equality? And what I think is that the opportunity is there. You make the zoning contingent on a percentage of these housing units being made available on an affordable basis. And there are lots of precedents for this around the country. The one everybody points to is Montgomery County, Maryland, where they've had thousands of affordable units built by making them a percentage of new construction. So the idea is that by making this of value to the people who already live in the suburb, they will not be so angry at the idea of upzoning to residential. And by making it have a percentage of affordable units, you do something for inequality. Now, the private market has discovered these corridors already. You go out to Portland, where land is relatively scarce because of the growth boundary. And you see that the developers are building these 4-story stick-built apartments. Seattle is another place where it's happening. And what's missing is an urban design. You try to get some coherence among these individual parcels as they get redeveloped. And what's also missing is transit. One thing that remember I mentioned that there would be a few different businesses that still want to be on these commercial strips. They could cluster in places which have access. And then you could put in bus rapid transit. And many of these suburban highways have plenty of room for a bus rapid transit. And you only need to widen the highway a little bit when you get to a station. For a part of it, it can be in a more narrow right-of-way. And if you back up a rezoning of these commercial strips with transit, you could easily support a big increase in population. And some proportion of that big increase in population could be affordable units. And even the portion that's not affordable might well be people who are not moving out to the fringe of the urban area, which is one of the places where the private market is really building apartments now, townhouses, is way out at the edge. So here's an option of doing something that's an alternative. So this is one way to redesign megaregions. Another way, which is also about zoning, is that when you look at the way housing is being built here in Austin, for example, but everywhere, the way zoning works, all the house lots are the same size. So that means that all the buildings in the subdivision that's being rebuilt are all the same general price range and general size. And that accentuates social segregation. It makes affordable housing much more difficult. And there's a simple answer, in my view, Here's a zoning map of the kind of houses we were just looking at. And here's approximately the same number of units. Some of them are on estate lots, which are bigger. Some of them are in row houses, which are much smaller lots. Some of them are on smaller residential lots. Some of them are on more or less the same size lots that you see on the left-hand side of the screen. And a certain proportion of the land is actually left in open space. And this can be done now if you have a planned unit development or you have a traditional neighborhood development, either one of these two things. But they're all special cases where you need a public hearing and a lot of opportunity for the neighbors to come in and jump up and down and scream. And most developers don't want it. They don't want to do these special districts. However, if you simply say, okay, you can do this, you can just build this if you like, or if you just use the same number of housing units, you could build some other configuration like this one. And there's something in the usual zoning, which is called the subdivision review, where they just review the proposal administratively without a public hearing and say, okay, does this fit the rules or doesn't it? So all you'd have to do to qualify for this is the usual site plan review. And my guess is if communities were willing to do this, they're not changing the density. They're only changing the minimum lot size, which is a technical provision inside the zoning code. And you go from 10,000 square foot minimum lot size to a 2,500 square foot minimum lot size or smaller. And you create the opportunity for a lot more variety. What has this got to do with equity? Again, there's a possibility that some of the buildings in this configuration could be subsidized. But in the main purpose of it is to make a more walkable community and make the zoning less cookie cutter and much more flexible. An accessory dwelling unit, that's sort of zoning speak for building in the backyard. You can add a second unit on a large single family lot, either as an addition on the back or on the side. And this happens to be from Santa Cruz in California, but many cities are now permitting this. And this can be popular with owners because the person who makes the money from this change is the property owner. So a proportion of people who live in these neighborhoods might be open to the idea of building an accessory unit because that means a source of income for them, helps them carry the house and the cost of the building the new unit. It also provides a place for members of the family whom they'd like to keep close, but not too close. So there's a political constituency for doing this. And if it were adopted at scale, it could increase the housing supply. There's instead of 100 units in a particular area, there could be 200 or 138 or 142, however many people are prepared to take advantage of this. What has this got to do with equality? Only that these additions are smaller and consequently they're more affordable. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a big social change. So, but this is something that all communities can easily do. And it's another possibility which carried out at scale and using zoning guidelines. This is from Vancouver, where the laneway, that is the alley behind the houses, can become the access for buildings that replace the garages. The difficulty, as I mentioned just earlier, this is a study being done in Seattle, is each of these dots only represents one additional dwelling unit. So to get the hundreds and hundreds of what they call backyard cottages, which you would need for development, you really need to have many more of these built. Now, some of you may have read about the change in the state of Oregon, where the legislature has changed the ability of the local communities to make their zoning regulations. So the local communities of a certain size have to provide an additional number of units for each residential lot in a single family zone. And they're saying you could do up to 4 units in these single family lots. And it's going to be something that anybody can do. You don't have to have a review. You don't have to have a special public hearing, you just do it. Now, I have a question, which I have about this, which is if you've taken a real estate course, or if you're familiar with real estate as a general subject, there's a rule of thumb that developers follow, which is that like no more than a quarter of the sales price ought to be paying the developer back from the cost of land acquisition. And if you talk to developers, they'll say a quarter, that's an awful lot of money. I would rather have 16% or maybe 20% of the sales price in the land cost. Now, if you go into a single family neighborhood where houses are costing $1 million, the 25% rule would mean that if you do 4 new units, as the Portland, Oregon example would allow you to do, each of those units should sell for $1 million so that the developer can get the land costs back, because there's a lot of other costs in building, construction costs and finance costs and so on. If a single family house is $500,000, which is more or less the median price of a house in Portland, Oregon, each of the new units would have to be $500,000. The only place where you can really go in and do this is where the individual houses are not too expensive. So if you had a $200,000 property and you tore it down and replaced it with 4 new apartments, each could sell for $200,000 and make the developer's profit work. But is this a good place to build 4 new units? If you're trying to create more affordable housing, you're going into an affordable neighborhood right now. And so you're buying out people who are probably first-generation homeowners, or very likely they're renters. So this is my question. It's a magic answer which the legislature in Oregon passed, and everybody feels really good about it. We've done something about inequality. But the question I have is it actually doing anything about inequality? And maybe we can come back and discuss that later. The other problem I have with it is that they have said you can do it by right. And there are no published guidelines to tell people how they're going to review it. So I happen to know this neighborhood. This is the Plaza North District in Kansas City, Missouri. And this in the 1960s and 70s, they rezoned it for higher density without any restrictions. And this is one street, Jefferson Street in this district. And this is what you get when you don't have design regulations. You get the remaining very affordable house, or originally affordable house. And then next door, you have relatively inexpensive rental apartments. Here it is again, same situation, a modest house, and then next door, a really big building. And if you're interested in urban design, this sort of thing doesn't really, this is yet another one of these drop-in apartment buildings with a big parking lot in the middle. And then the original house is down the block. This is not good urban design. And it could have been a lot better if somebody had made some effort to manage it when it was happening. Now, what's happening, what could have happened is you could have had design guidelines. Portland actually has design guidelines. This example on the right shows putting in 5 houses where 2 were before. Now, this raises the same kind of question, but these about value, but these houses are worth spending some money for. So it doesn't necessarily make them affordable, but it definitely increases the density, which increases the housing supply. So you get 5 houses where you had 2. But and they also had a lot of, this is a big 100-page book, had a lot of design guidelines. Again, this wasn't a public hearing. This was like subdivision review. You would bring your plans in, the city planning department would look at the guidelines and look at your plans and say, okay, you need to make a couple of minor changes, but this is what we suggest. There was no intention to prevent development. It was just trying to make it fit into the existing community, which from an urban design point of view, I think is a desirable outcome. This is from a housing guide from the city of Toronto, where most of these things are saying there should be good sunlight on a piece of open land that you're saving for as an amenity for the project is not necessarily a high cost item for the developer, depends on the site. But most of these design guidelines are not raising cost, they're causing designers to take more trouble, which as designers don't cost a lot of money, unfortunately, that's probably going to happen. So then there's one more big opportunity, possibility for making megaregions more equal. And you have an excellent example here in Austin, where you have the old Mueller Field, which was the city's main airport until the new airport was built. And the city owned the airport, and they said, okay, we don't need it as an airport anymore. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. We'll make a plan, and we'll make it essentially residential with some industry, commercial, and some parks, and we'll make a quarter of it affordable. And this is under construction now, as you saw in the previous slide. A lot of it's been built. The multifamily part is still the part that's not been really built up yet. And this is probably where more of the affordable units are going to go. But there's a lot of underutilized space in areas which have already urbanized. And if you look for large pieces of land, like an old factory, which are in one ownership, and you have a redevelopment plan at the city, many of those places are zoned industrial, so they have to be rezoned. As a condition of the rezoning, making the new development have a percentage of affordable units is a possibility for cities. Notice that every time I mention affordable, I also mention a percentage. 25% is actually high for affordable homes. The wisdom of sociologists and real estate people is that you don't want to make 100% affordable units like Bluebonnet. The reason is that they are concerned that people who have a choice won't buy into this neighborhood if there are too many affordable units. I don't know if they're right, but this is the assumption that everybody's making. So that when people talk about increasing affordable housing, they're talking about increasing a percentage of the units. Or as in the case of Portland, they're only talking about changing the housing supply to include more affordable units, but they won't be affordable by really poor people unless there's some kind of subsidy involved as well. So these are the pieces of the puzzle that I'm laying out for this group. And let's see. What I'd like to do is try to get back to the gallery. Here we go. I have some questions for discussion. I've laid out some options for communities, which are rezoning these commercial corridors, making suburban zoning more flexible, encouraging accessory dwelling units, maybe doing what they've done in the state of Oregon, and then taking advantage of going back into the already built up areas and finding opportunities for infill development, which can be at a small scale, but where you have an opportunity like the Mueller Field in Austin, it's an opportunity to make a big change. So I thought I would ask participants in our program today, let's start with rezoning of commercial corridors. I think that the real estate market is knocking on the door of communities and saying, hey, we would build housing in these disused commercial sites if you will rezone them to make it possible for us to do it. Do you think that this has a potential for improving equity? You know, I've been talking, you should talk.
So anyone feel free to jump in. No need to raise your hands or something, just.
You do need to unmute though.
Yes, of course. Unmute yourself. Or you can wave your hand so that we do not have some competing, right? So anyone, feel free.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. This was pretty awesome. I think in terms of equity, I think it is very promising. I'm not sure how many Mueller developments there are out there, you know, it being a former airport and all that, but I think especially comparing just how dense Mueller is compared to the rest of Austin. I think there is an opportunity in that, and as well with the affordable aspect of it. I do think I'm from California, and accessory dwellings have been really big in making allowing for construction where it might not otherwise occur. So I think that's overall pretty good for equity as well.
Austin has accessory units. I just couldn't find a guidebook for them, so I didn't have any visuals. All I have is a long list of requirements. But it is something that Austin is already looking at. Let's go back to these commercial corridors for a second. I showed you this surprise. When I was putting this presentation together, I saw this prison-like structure in the middle of a commercial strip that I found in Google. And I said, what in the world is that? And I went out of Google Earth and into the regular map, and it was identified as Bluebonnet Studios. So I looked them up. And that turns out to be a highly concentrated single room occupancy development, which is affordable. And there's a long waiting list apparently, and people are anxious to get in there, but it's very minimal housing and it's very concentrated. It's all affordable because it's heavily subsidized. It's not just because they're small, but it's both of these things. So do you think that lining these commercial corridors with housing that's designed specifically to be affordable is a good alternative?
Yes, Lisa.
I also want to thank you for this presentation. I'm finding it very interesting. One of the things that I'm thinking about is, so in New York City, I had heard about the kind of the boroughs or the areas where there's a walkable area for like 10 blocks. And so they've mixed different areas. There's commercial, and then there's people living in different size homes in that area. So I am kind of thinking about if you just change it from commercial to residential, if that also still has the residential close to commercial, like grocery stores or shopping.
Well, it could be. I mean, obviously the situations vary amazingly from just one portion of a commercial corridor to another. But the theory is that there still will be commercial in the commercial strip, and a grocery store is probably one of the more viable uses because you have to go there in person. I shouldn't say that. We've been getting groceries delivered during the pandemic. So, but if you, I think there's a reason why you might want to go to a grocery store. And they are probably likely to want to be near a transit stop and also near a major crossroad. So when you do, I think just doing an upzoning of the commercial corridors would not be very effective because it would just mean a free-for-all and more bluebonnets. That what you need to do is a master plan if you are the community, and you say, okay, here's an opportunity. We will rezone. If you remember the map, which showed that there was a spotty opportunity zones here and there, opportunity sites here and there along the commercial corridor. You say, okay, as a policy, we're going to remap to residential. But when we do, we're going to do it on the basis of a master plan. And the master plan ought to include mixed use. What you are doing by, I think you prioritize apartments and townhouses because the land is too valuable to do single family houses. And in most of the country, there are plenty of them anyway. That is what I showed you in Whittier, California is typical. You have a commercial zone and then backing right up to it are single family houses. So that it's like a cliff. You have high density along the commercial park corridor, and then wham, you're into single family lots. And so by introducing townhouses and garden apartments, you automatically create a variety of housing types around that particular district. And if you wanted to, when I showed you the Portland or Seattle examples, those buildings have commercial on the ground floor, or can have. So that that may be helpful in justifying what are still higher land costs. But I think the big thing is the community has to manage it. You can't do what the state legislature did in Oregon and say, magic bullet, upzone all single family lots in communities bigger than X, Y, 1,000 people. Okay, we've solved the affordability problem. We're going home now. I think that's going to be a disaster if it's done. It's much more likely not to happen because of the economics of it. But if it does, it's not going to be what you want. It's going to be more gentrification of the poor neighborhoods and the status quo in terms of. So I'm very skeptical about it. I'm giving the great thing about the pandemic has been Zoom, because here I am sitting in Philadelphia, and there you are. I guess you're all in Austin. A lot of you are in Austin. I see John Landis's name, so he's in Philadelphia. But it's, I would say you lose maybe 20% by having me give a slideshow from here as opposed to in your classroom, but it's not a big loss. And I get to go and give a talk in Seattle on Friday. And you know, in the normal times, or what used to be normal, I would have to fly there, which will take a day, and then recuperate, and then give a 1-hour talk, and go through the whole thing in reverse. So, in any case, we have to be alive to the changes that are happening, and it's pretty clear that commercial corridors are not going to go back to what they were before. And they weren't doing that well before. So I think there's a huge lever there which you can push, which will change. Now, what about the next one on my list, which was this idea that, okay, you can keep quarter-acre zoning out there at the edge of the developing megalopolis, but we'll take this technical thing inside the zoning code, which is the minimum lot size, and we'll just say, okay, minimum lot size is 100 by 20, which is the size of a townhouse. So but we're keeping the density the same, remember. So if you want to build all 100 units as townhouses, you're not going to take up a lot of this land, but that's fine if that's what you want to do. But minimum lot size is 2,000 square feet instead of 10,000. And you as a developer are free to propose any kind of plan. And our planning department in the site plan review, which we do for all subdivision anyway, we'll look at our guidebook and make sure you're doing it right. But by and large, you don't need a public hearing. You don't need it ratified by the county council or the city council. You can just do it. My guess, and it's only a guess because no one is doing this, my guess is that you would get a lot more variety within individual subdivisions. And remember, people out there are building they're buying 1,000-acre plots, and then they all get developed at the same density, like half an acre or 1/10 of an acre or whatever. So when people look at the suburbs and say cookie cutter, that's where the cookie cutting is done, at the lot size. So I think if you do this, you can improve the variety of development that's taking place in the growth areas. The question which I'm asking you, though, is what does this do for equity? Well, you have some choices. Nothing, not much. It's a great idea. It'll make everything different. I mean, come on, tell me something.
Folks, I can encourage you to jump in, to participate. No punishment if you say anything wrong.
Are you still asking specifically about the commercial corridors?
No, I've moved on to the second question on the screen, which is flexible suburban zoning.
Didn't hear that part. I think.
Well, let me repeat it. That is, do you remember what I said about it? That you just changed the minimum lot size?
Yeah, I remember that part. I think my audio cut out. Yeah, no, I think that could improve equity a lot, especially as it pertains to having the different housing types, which I think is a lot of what you've been talking about, rather than just the what a developer might perceive as the absolute easiest type of development to produce like that standard single family type development. I think showing that it's not too difficult to make a much more equitable development could be quite helpful and provide more options to all different types of people at different
That,
stages.
that I think is one aspect of equality which doesn't get as much attention. That's a single people deserve some housing choices between an apartment and a 4-bedroom house. And young people who are making an income, but or old people who are tired of mowing the lawn. And, you know, all of these people would like to stay in their neighborhoods. I think, well, not all of them, but some of them would. And in the case of the suburban zoning, if it's done the way it's actually happening on these commercial corridors right now, it's all apartments and it's all relatively small ones in these 4-story buildings right on the street. If you do it according to the diagram that I was showing you by the California, San Francisco firm, Friedman Sasaki, they had a more idealistic view that you could mix rather friendly ground to the ground garden apartments over parking with townhouses, and that this would be more in keeping with the single family neighborhoods behind them. And it doesn't do a lot for people who are low income unless you reserve units for low income families.
Well, this is John Landis. Can you hear me or?
I can hear you.
Good. Hi, everyone. Well, if you look at Montgomery County, Maryland, which I know, Jonathan, you're familiar with, they have 40 years of experience using inclusionary housing, which they require between 15 and 20% of projects above a certain size to be affordable to people of moderate income housing, moderate means, sorry. And they've produced somewhere between 25 and 30,000 units in those 40 years, or developers have produced, but they've only been able to drive the affordability level down to about 80% of area median income, which goes to Jonathan's point, which is if you want a deeper affordability level, you really have to directly subsidize it. So, you know, the idea of, you're mentioning more flexible suburban zoning, which can be done in the same way of giving density bonuses. It's the same sort of idea of allowing people to do more density, and it's a great idea for moderate and working family households, but getting to poor households has been a problem even in Montgomery County.
Yeah, and that's a good point. What is your statistic again? 80% of average family income in Montgomery County, or?
Yeah, I mean, Montgomery County is a pretty wealthy one. I would imagine 80% of area median incomes probably on the order of $60,000 or maybe $70,000, given the wealth of Montgomery County. So, but in Texas, where median incomes in most places are lower, you could reach people who are of modest means. You know, we're looking at maybe how families would make $40,000 to $50,000, which is not the poor folks.
Well, that was what I didn't mention, but probably should have. When I showed you the example of Kansas City of the North Plaza District, where those changes were made in the 70s and 60s, where they just dropped in the apartment units without changing anything in other than just making an upzoning. One of the things that's happened in that district is it's now become trendy. And if you want to buy a 1,000 square foot bungalow in that district, I looked it up the other day, it's going to cost you about $350,000. So that was an affordable housing neighborhood at the time. And the original apartments, which were dropped in there, were affordable apartments. But it's a great location, and a 2-bedroom apartment there is now a couple of $1,000s a month. And the houses, if you can find one, are $300,000 to $400,000 to buy. So this brings us slightly out of order, but to the whole Portland question of the economic feasibility of this kind of upzoning, that I question where you can find places where the private market wants to build, wants to take a single family lot and build 4 units on it.
If I may jump in here, say that to really make a affordable housing program to work, this potential, say in the suburban size, by relaxing the zoning control, I think affordable transportation should go together, whether it's a monetary cost of traveling or for transportation, or a time cost. For example, if it's quite far away from job centers or job locations of those households who buy those affordable units, and then how difficult, how easy they can access to jobs, for example. So this affordable housing and affordable transportation should go together.
Well, this is a great, advertisement for the Mueller Austin, because one of the things that it does is it takes a couple of thousand units, which would probably otherwise have been built out on the fringe of the way the city is developing, and put them right in the center. And in a relatively low income area, it's not one of the high income parts of Austin. And that means that people are closer to jobs, the point that you were making. And it also diminishes the unnecessary paving over of agricultural or forest land or just open land, which from an environmental point of view is extremely useful. So Mueller Austin may only be 25% affordable by giving that part of the city a new boost. It may have done quite a lot for equality in a sort of an indirect way. That is, it's not far from the traditional African-American neighborhoods. And then maybe this helps them become more economically viable and so on, just by its proximity. I don't know Austin well enough to know how that would actually work. But I think that reinvesting in disadvantaged urban districts will do a lot for equality. Although it's going to be a painful process because nobody wants it. There's the, if you are a city council person from a minority district and some developer is proposing to bring in a lot of new people who may not be your voters, you are not so excited about that. And if you live in that neighborhood and you think that the price of your rent is going to go up, you're not so happy about it either. So if you're going to make, Mueller Austin is easy because it was one piece of land in a single ownership. If you were going to go into the older parts of these cities where there are a lot of vacant lots, like North Philadelphia, you need to be able to pair big investment with public investment. So big private investment and big public investment, so that you can tell the community, look, there's going to be a new public library, there's going to be a new public school. And you have to do that because the people who are being brought into this community by this new opportunity aren't going to buy or rent there unless they have these things. And that might be a way of creating equality of government services in older districts by taking advantages of this. I don't know if that's happening around Mueller or not, because the city owned the airport. So there wasn't so many opportunities for people to be against it. I'm sure there was a lot of fuss and bother about it, but in the long run, the city could prevail. But there, you look from the air at a lot of, and I didn't show you any of these slides, but if you look at Detroit or many other, St. Louis, many other big cities, you see a huge amount of vacant land in the core of these cities, but it's not all in one place. And cities could put that together. They could get rid of the pollution on the sites. They could market to developers, but they couldn't do it politically unless the people who live in that neighborhood are okay with it. And that's going to be a heavy lift. So I think this is maybe a theme that runs through this whole inequality issue. There's the tools are there to make megaregions much more equal, and to get rid of one of the major causes of the growth of megaregions physically on the ground, which is people getting out of someplace they don't like anymore and going someplace where they hope it will be better. If you can get rid of that dynamic, you could accomplish a great deal. The problem is you can't just do it by having the legislature change zoning. It has to be a whole bunch of government programs all focused on achieving these objectives.
Actually, I have some questions or like initial ideas about this topic. Especially Professor Zhang just mentioned that we should put the affordable transportation and housing together. So I have read some articles about saying that the new transportation investment will lead to kinds of gentrification, which means so for example, if there could be a better public transit service in my neighborhood, and in this case, the property tax will raise, and also such as there could be more like educated or more people who like the new urbanism lifestyle will come to my neighborhood, while this could used to be a neighborhood where the vulnerable groups gathering. So which means that so what I'm understanding is like the new public transportation investment not only leads to equity advantages in this neighborhood, but also it can affect it from a negative perspective. So how could planners deal with this situation?
Well, I think that's a very important issue, and the problem with it is it's a famous chicken egg issue. That is, it's hard to build transit if you don't think you're going to have riders, and it's hard to get the riders if you don't have the transit. And so, what I was suggesting, for example, for the commercial corridors, most of those commercial corridors actually go someplace, which is important for a transportation improvement. You need to connect places where people want to go. You can't just put transportation in here and there. It has to have a route. So these commercial corridors probably do correspond to viable transportation routes. And the problem is that the density of population in the single family neighborhoods around them is not usually considered high enough to support a transit investment. If you come in and you start building apartments, then you have the density. So it seems to me, again, you need a master plan, you need a coordinated plan. You could begin by, for example, improving the frequency of local buses, which are probably running on those highways anyway. And you say instead of coming once an hour, maybe they come once every quarter hour. That would make a big difference to people right there. And you'd subsidize that because you are trying to make this land use change occur. And the land use change is beneficial to the city because it raises the tax rates, because an empty commercial development isn't going to pay a lot of real estate tax. So again, circumstances vary all over. I mean, you can't do one concept and have it work anywhere, except in one place where the one concept was devised. But I can see an incremental way of putting in transit. And as you were saying, the transit is a great force for equality, because if people can get to jobs, they have many more opportunities than they do if there's only job opportunities in their neighborhood, or if they have to go 2 or 2.5 hours a day to get from their home to their job, or even 5 hours a day to get to their job, which is very unfair. So again, your communities have to go in there and say, okay, we are going to make this commercial street a transportation corridor. And we're going to support that by remapping the commercial land to a mixed use, assuming certain XYZ conditions are, and as a token of our good faith, we're going to improve the bus service right now. I mean, Seattle is a place where they have actually taken conventional buses and called them rapid transit, and it's working pretty well. They didn't basically have to build anything, not even a right-of-way. What they did is they made it easier to get on and off the buses, and they've made a possibility of buying your ticket before you get on. And those two simple changes, I see, Lisa, you're amused by this. Those two simple changes do a lot. I mean, this whole business of standing in line for 10 minutes to get on a bus is one of the reasons why bus service is so bad. So you can do it. It's going to be, I mean, this is the thing about urban design, that it's easy to draw a picture of what you want to have happen, but to make it happen, you have to understand the mechanisms that will make it work.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Let's talk about accessory dwelling
yes.
units. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yes, I have a question. Because years ago when I have a housing policy class back in Minnesota, we talk about the fair sharing housing policy. That's a policy when you project, like in Minnesota, a state, project the affordable housing demand and distribute that share into different communities that you should build like 10 affordable housing units in your community and 20 in another. But this policy is not works very well because they have not such a strong government to input this. But I think that might be a good policy for regional planning, like in a mega regional level, to coordinate the affordable housing issue instead of in a community level to say the affordable housing demand. I guess my question is, do you think that's flexible or it's a good policy in terms in a mega regional level? Because I think housing is sometimes it's a really community level things than a regional level things.
I think you picked an example of something which is very rational and which from a policy point of view is it's not easy to say it, but it's for say, okay, what's wrong with these communities? And that's just sort of what the Oregon State Legislature is thinking it's doing. Is saying what's wrong with these communities is they are what they call exclusive. And in fact, the real estate people probably advertise them as exclusive. And exclusive means some people are not allowed to live here. And essentially, these people who are not allowed to live there are people with lower incomes. So what they said in New Jersey, if you study the whole Mount Laurel court decision, you actually had a court decision in New Jersey which said that the local communities effectively were obligated to take a share, fair share. Otherwise, they're discriminating. And the Mount Laurel decision has resulted in some affordable housing being built in some communities, but the legislature gave some outs to it. A community that wants to stay exclusive can make a contribution to another community to help them build affordable housing, which seems to me defeats the whole idea of it. The second thing is that when it comes right down to it, what happens is that there's a state agency which says to a county, okay, you have to have, or let's say a local community, you have to have 230 dwelling units, which are affordable, built in your next tranche of development. And then the authorities in the community say, well, let's talk about this. And they negotiate. And I know in one community in New Jersey, quite recently, what happened is the state agency started with 230 units, and they negotiated it down to 105 or something like that. And they put them all in a commercial district in the very southeast corner of the community. So that while it was technically integrated into the community, they stuck it in a corner. So it was as unintegrated as it possibly could be. And this makes me, this is why I think the Montgomery County thing is, despite its problem of not, the advantage of the Montgomery County approach has been that the affordable units are more or less indistinguishable from the less affordable units. And you can't tell by looking at a row house whether it's they are, if you're a skilled designer, you can probably see they save money here and there on the building. But by and large, people are integrated into the community. Their buildings cost less, but they are not distinguishable socially. As opposed to the Bluebonnet example that I showed you earlier, where you stick 100 or a couple of hundred single people, all in a prison-like structure, all paying an affordable rent, and therefore have a big waiting list, but stuck in the middle of an industrial commercial location, which has not got a master plan for renovating. So the thing about Montgomery County, which is missing from Mount Laurel, is some concept that when you are done with building the affordable units, everybody should be integrated into one community. And you don't have to be friends with your neighbors, but at least you say hello to them and you know who they are. And if there's a problem, you can talk to them about it, and so on. And it seems to me that proximity is actually a really big way of fostering communication and then something approaching equality. Now, the place where this approach is strongest has been in the Scandinavian countries, where the public housing authorities buy units in public housing, in private development, and they buy a percentage of units and they rent them out to housing tenants who need assistance. And you can live in a hallway, and 2 doors down is somebody who's getting assisted living, assisted payments from the municipality, and you aren't, and most of the people in the hallway aren't, but they are. And you meet them at the rubbish collection place or waiting for the elevator, and it's more or less one community. Now, this may work better in Sweden, say, where traditionally you have a very strong social hierarchy, so that people don't depend on knowing what their neighbors make as income for determining whether they're really equal or not. I mean, if you are from an old Swedish family and somebody is an immigrant, there's no question in their old Swedish family mind that they are superior. They don't care if you live next door. And so one of the big problems with fostering equality here has been social insecurity, that people get mad if they have a 2-bedroom apartment, which they're paying X dollars for, and the people down the hall have a 2-bedroom apartment and they're getting financial help, paying for it. That makes the first person group angry. And I don't know what you do about that. There's a lot of people in this country who are very angry. And they are angry for precisely this reason. And they think other people are getting stuff they ought to have. And that is a big obstacle to creating equality, which is that you really have to deal with that whole political situation. You have to make people who are more advantaged than some, but are feeling really mad that they're not as advantaged as they would like to be, somehow comfortable with the idea that other people can have stuff too. And when you get down on the trouble with all these social science issues is you pull on something that seems to make sense, which is there's this thread and this huge ball of wool, which is, let's see if we can hold down the price of an apartment or a house. And you pull on it and suddenly the whole social structure lands in your lap. And so you have to be aware of this. So you have to be a little bit sneaky. You say the big reason for rezoning the commercial corridors is because the old people in your community would like to stay there but don't want to mow the lawn anymore. And your kids want to live in your community where they grew up, but they can't afford a full house. And that goes for these accessory dwelling units also. It's a place for Granny to live without being in your house, but close by where you can keep an eye on her, but not so close that she's interfering with your personal life all the time. So that's a reason why you might approve having accessory dwelling unit. Also, the school teacher, who everybody likes but can't afford to live in your community, might be able to afford one of these accessory dwelling units. Or might be able to afford an apartment in a commercial corridor. So you have to frame these equality issues to please the people who have a say-so in the existing situation. And that's another reason why I think this argument on single family upzoning is dangerous. I don't know what's going to happen. But the legislator has just said, if you don't like it, too bad. And I don't know what that's going to do. But what I think, as what I said earlier, is I think that it has much more limited application than the legislature thought because of the financial problem of doing it. But if you really did allow anybody to upzone any single family lot in any district and suddenly make it 4 apartments, that is going to be very divisive.
So Jonathan, the discussion is open for other questions as well on your list. On your question list. Sorry, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
The class, I don't know if they can hear you.
Yeah, okay. If I no, so because you were, oops, you were at question number 2. Are we moving on to other questions? Any
I
questions?
thought we covered all the questions.
Okay, yeah, in the sense, right? So, and the question about the Mueller one, Austin, the Mueller redevelopment. To my knowledge, here, Mueller development actually now has become a fair kind of a middle to upper level community. Is quite expensive, and of course, and then if the required percentage or share of affordable housing units and does occur, then overall is a good thing. And then the question whether or not there are other opportunities like Mueller. I don't know if those land currently like warehouses, industrial uses. Austin has been growing so fast. So there are many laws actually right now already kind of like in-town laws. And still in their original uses, like a Kramer area, Kramer Station area to the north, lots of warehouses, lots of industrial uses are really not suitable for this area, or the surrounding lots are already developed as residential units or other services. So I think those lots could be potential lots for developments like Mueller. The challenge is the cost. Some lots, some of them may need cleaning, or at least inspection, whether or not it is contaminated or not. So.
What would be very helpful for, and it's not an idea which hasn't been brought up many times, but if a city government in Austin, which is a rich community, might be able to do this, you create a fund, and you need initial capital for the fund. And the fund allows you to buy and assemble these properties and get rid of the pollution. And you then package them up, as they would say, and you say, okay, we've got contiguous properties up representing 4 acres or 12 acres or whatever. And we have dealt with all the environmental issues, and we are prepared to change the zoning to fit your development if you will buy this from us. And our asking price is sufficient that we get enough of our money back that we can put it back in the fund so we can use this to do it somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I think you need the government to get in there and start the process, and they need money to start it. And that's where everything is stalled. I mean, this is something that could be done in Detroit, for example. There's a lot of vacant land, a lot of it's contiguous. Mostly they are houses that were demolished, and the way they demolished the houses is they just bulldozed them into the cellar. So inside the what looks like a grassy lot, there are a lot of old fuel oil tanks and bits and pieces of asbestos and stuff. And no developer is going to buy that lot because it's nothing but trouble. So the city has to come in, it has to clean up the lots. It has to put them all together. They don't all have to be contiguous, but they have to be in the same general area. And they have to be at a large enough scale that a real estate investor can come in and do something. But, and the other problem with that also is you also have to make sure that there are amenities in the community, as I was going on about before with the public library and the school, because the buyers will want this and the people who remain in the community will demand it. So it means a really big initiative. It could be
Yes.
done. I mean, I
It
think
could be,
go into Google and you look
yes.
at what's possible, there's plenty of space.
Indeed. And I heard another approach was this through land swapping. So instead of the city or a public sector pays upfront cost to purchase it, to buy the land, cleaning up, then it can negotiate some kind of like a land swapping, say for industrial site, for example, and yeah, we can offer you a piece of land further away from the city center, but maybe bigger, but you provide this land for non-industrial, for the city to use, for example, residential or mixed use. So that could be an approach to negotiate a deal. In terms of the accessory unit, that practice, I heard some people, discussions or lectures on these two possible concerns. I'd like to hear your thoughts, Jonathan. And one is that to what extent it can help increase the housing stock, housing supply. If you increase it too much, and then the infrastructure, right, the sewer system, the water, the traffic, all of those, and how much they can accommodate the additional units or additional households or population. That's one. And then in great locations like downtown, close to downtown Austin, many households who have converted the accessory units, they actually use it for Airbnb, like that practice, and not necessarily to provide a housing supply to the residents.
Well, I remember doing plan in Norfolk, Virginia, and the question about affordable units is that the likely renters would be 4 sailors who would be at sea a lot of the time, but when they were home, they would be giving big parties and it would be really noisy. And people said, we don't want backyard cottages for this reason, because the people who are going to use them are going to be, I'm sure, perfectly nice people individually, but collectively they're a big nuisance. So one thing the city can do is it can say this is only possible for owner-occupied units. That is, if you are living in your house, you can build an accessory dwelling unit in the backyard, but you can't rent out your house and the accessory unit. This means that if there's a party in the backyard, you are kept awake as well as your neighbors. So that is one sanction. There wasn't enough in Norfolk, I don't think, but the where you really had a major block of people who they didn't want to have doing this. But the other thing, when you mentioned the infrastructure, I think you need the design guidelines to deal with parking. There's one of the things that's not explained again in the Oregon legislation is if you go from 1 unit to 4, where do people park? And many families have more than 1 car. And the guidelines for the city of Portland, which they did in 2008, where they went from 2 units to 5, they showed where to park the cars. And they showed where you could still have a lawn and so forth and so on. So that's something that needs guidance. In terms of what happens to the sewer system and that kind of question, I think that one of the answers to that is that the number of people actually living in a dwelling unit has gone down. Because when a lot of neighborhoods were built, a typical family had 3, 4, 5 people. A family house had 5 people living in it. There would be an older relative. There would be several children. So you'd have a mother, father, 2 children, and grandma. Nowadays, the number of people per housing unit is more like 2, or some number you can't imagine, like 2.1. I mean, who are those families? And consequently, the stress on the sewer system and the water supply may not be increased by building the accessory dwelling unit, because in the older neighborhoods, you're building it back to what they thought they were going to have to build for in the first place. I don't know if that argument holds true everywhere. It's a plausible story. If you're building newer neighborhoods, then the question is, okay, you're going to build a sewer capacity to support it.
Thank you, Jonathan. And other comments or thoughts or questions from the audience? If not, it's also approaching the time of today's session. Well, then let me throw in one anecdotal evidence with you, Jonathan, with others in terms of the converting low density into high density. This is happening in Houston. And Houston, as you all know, the city of Houston does not have zoning ordinance, the only major city in the US. And my son bought a home in a lot. It used to be a single family home back in the 40s. It's in Houston Heights. A single family home, a very big lot. It's like still like a 1/3 acre or a 1/4 acre. But the developer builder converted the single family home into 6 units, 6 single family unit lots. So the same lot now with 6 homes, all single family, detached, no yards. So really 4 stories even. It's a very, very big home, but much higher density. So this is happening in Houston. Lots of those old neighborhoods in the 40s, 50s, there were suburbs, now close to the center. So this kind of thing, I guess, can only happen in Houston, right? They don't have it zoning. As long as the neighbors agree, neighboring lot owners agree that they can do that. So a general comment on question and comment on this is, well, zoning ordinance, zoning practice is really doing good or bad to our community, to our neighborhoods.
Well, it looks like the state legislature in Oregon has converted, say, Portland from a city that may have been overly exclusive, but was beautifully managed from a design point of view, into Houston. And without the deed restrictions, which in Houston, some neighborhoods are immune from this kind of development because there's an agreement among all the property holders that they are following certain rules. Do you happen to remember the names of any of these Houston neighborhoods? I'm giving this talk on Friday in the Seattle and Portland region, Cascadia Megaregion. And I maybe should show them some slides of Houston. That would be more effective than the Kansas City ones I just showed you.
Okay. Yeah, the Houston Heights.
Which height?
Houston Heights. That's
Houston
the neighborhood.
Heights. Okay, I'm going
Yeah,
to.
there are probably many other neighborhoods as well, but I know Houston Heights because my son lives there. So.
Okay, well, I'm going to look up Houston Heights on Google and see whether.
Right, you will see that. Yeah. Well,
show the future to the people on the West Coast.
Right. Well, it's now almost 12 o'clock. Thank you so much, Professor Barnett, for giving this talk. Really refreshing, because in the past when we talk about mega regions, they're always like a fly-in, right? We're at very high altitude, and now you bring us down to the ground. Really think about the building level, street level, corridor level, neighborhood level. What could we do to accommodate the future mega demand growth in terms of the land, the space, and transportation here? So I really like your interpretation of design. Design is not just about the physical aspect of the buildings or neighborhood, but also design concerning the zoning design, right? The regulatory changes and the corridor level street design, of course. So, and this also another notion I like it a lot in the very first slide. Interstate highways are main streets of megaregion, right? It's an urban design lens to look into the megaregion, and then addressing the megaregion issue, in particular the inequality. So I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to talk to this group, which very interesting questions and discussion. So,
yeah, great. And then everyone else, Jonathan, if you could stop sharing your screen, and everyone, do you mind showing your faces so that I'll take a screenshot? No, Jonathan, could you stay just for 1 second? Let me take a screenshot. And okay, let me see. Review. Done. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you all for joining us. And for those in the Megaregion class, please stay 1 or 2 minutes.
Okay, goodbye now.
Thank you again.
Bye.